Okay. Hello, everyone. Many thanks for joining us today. This is the first webinar that the Post-Keynesian Economic Society is co-organizing with the Italian Post-Keynesian Network. This is part of the initiative that the Post-Keynesian Economic Society has taken to collaborate with other Post-Keynesian societies around the world. As some of you might know, in April and May, the PKES organized webinars with the Argentinian Post-Keynesian Association. Particularly, we had 3 webinars which focused on post-Keynesian economics and developing countries. So we aim to take more of such initiatives in the coming years to support the work of the Post-Keynesians around the world. So in these 2 webinars that we organize with the IPKN, we will focus on the recent development of heterodox macroeconomic models. Before I introduce our speakers and the structure of the session today, I would like to ask from Federico to say a few words for IPKN. Federico, go ahead.
Yeah, sure. Thanks. So as I was saying, it will be very short indeed. So maybe some of you know that the Italian Post-Keynesian Network is a newly born project. So it born in November 2020, after more than 1 year of discussions about how to join Italians or Italy-based scholars that recognize somehow the post-Keynesian tradition as a common ground for developing some approaches alternative to the neoclassical and the new Keynesian mainstream. So the reason is that the Italian heterodox tradition is pretty rich. So mainly I think about the tradition relying on, among many others, Piero Sraffa or Pierangelo Gaignani or Ludovico Pasinetti or Paolo Silos Labini again. But the problem is that in Italy, these authors are often neglected or anyway not sufficiently acknowledged, also because of, and know it's the tyranny of the mainstream review standards. But the fact is that, especially in these times of interconnected financial, ecological, social, or health crisis, these approaches becomes extremely relevant, and despite their theoretical or epistemological differences, they are still highly cross-fertilizing and relevant. So the idea of this network was to put together scholars that were keen to work on these traditions in order to also give larger visibility to young scholars working on that. So since the beginning, it was pretty clear that our reference model was the Post-Keynesian Economic Society. And by the way, many members of the Post-Keynesian Economic Society supported and provided a relevant impulse for the project. I think maybe about Engelbert Stockhammer. And that's why we wish to acknowledge you actually for this support to this project that, as I said, is newly born but rapidly developing. So since November 2020, we have been organizing scientific seminars, so mainly targeting young scholars, young or not young, but scholars. So seminars, workshops, or collective books presentations. But we have also been organizing more educative projects, so targeting, I would say, a broader audience by mainly presenting books or organizing roundtables. And our next projects, for example, include in July a Pasinetti lecture. So Nadia Arbellini and Enrico Bellino will hold a lecture on the Pasinetti contribution to the post-Keynesian theory. Then we will host in September Mauro Gallegati, who will present his new book, The Market Made People Free and Other Neoliberalism Lies. We will then host in October Anna Carabelli, which will present her new books on Keynesian uncertainty. And in November, specifically for the 10 years since the death of Pierangelo Gaignani, we are organizing with Docento Sraffa some correlated events to remember, for instance, Gaignani. So I will not take more time on that. So if you want to get more information, you can go to our Facebook webpage, which is IPKN, Italian Post-Keynesian Network. You can find there every information, and you can find also our past events that we recorded and made available to anyone. And you can, of course, if you have any if you want any information or any question, you can write to our email, which is ipknetwork@gmail.com. So I stop here, and I thank again the PKES for involving us in the organization of this excellent workshop.
Many thanks, Federico, for that. And we're going to share this information in the chat box for those of you who are interested about that. So now the structure of the webinar is as follows. So we are going to have a 20-minute presentation, and this will be followed by 5 minutes of discussion by our discussant, and then we will have 10 to 15 minutes for a Q&A session. I will record the presentation and the comments from the discussion, but I will not record the Q&A session. So let me start with the first presentation. Lilit Popoyan, a postdoctoral research fellow from Scuola Superiore Sant'Anna, will give a presentation on systemically important banks. And then Ermanno Catullo, a lecturer from University di Tiramo, will be the discussant. Okay, Lilit, over to you. Would you like to share your screen with you?
Thank you, Maria. I will start with sharing. Perhaps you can already start to see the slides.
We can see the slides, thanks. Please go ahead. Perfect.
Okay. So good afternoon, everyone. I'm very pleased to share the day with you the Post-Keynesian Economics and Macroeconomic Modeling webinar. Thanks a lot for the organizers for the event and the invitation. I'm very delighted to share this very last piece of work with you that is co-authored with Mauro Napoletano and Andrea Roventini. The work that I'm presenting is still a work in progress, so your comments are more than welcome. And it is addressing the impact of additional capital surcharges on systemically important banks in the financial system as an instrument of curbing the financial instability. I would like to start my presentation with this slide. And this is a figure that probably many of you are very familiar with, and it shows the connection between the most important financial institutions in the period of the crisis and the global financial crisis of 2007 and 2009 highlighted the fallacies and inadequacies of banking regulation, both in terms of microprudential and microprudential and macroprudential policies. So moreover, the Lehman Brothers collapse, the bankruptcy in 2008, showed how the collapse of the single but big enough financial institution can jeopardize financial stability almost to the level of bringing the entire financial system on its knees. So after the financial crisis, these financial giants received a lot of attention because there was a need to understand who are those and how to neutralize them. When I say neutralize, I mean two aspects. First of all, the regulators and also academia was caring about how to find methodologies and regulations not allowing those financial giants to spread their risk-taking behavior to their partners. And secondly, to create a pool of capital, pool of money, so that in case of failure of these financial giants, those are able to care about themselves. So after the financial crisis, this literature was flourishing, and driven by these considerations, the motivation of this work is fivefold. First of all, the financial crisis of 2007 and 2009 highlighted the role of global systemically important banks and financial institutions and their role in transmitting the financial shocks across the market. Given their size, complexity, interconnectedness, distress, or the disorderly resolution of these financial institutions have caused significant disruptions in the broader financial system and also in economic activity, and have at times required public sector bailouts. Secondly, motivated by such considerations, the identification of these systemically important banks became of paramount importance for financial stability and supervisory purposes. So this literature of identification and localization, the neutralization of systemically important financial institutions and global systemically important bank impacts has flourished in recent years, but often definitions of these systemically important and methodologies to assess significantly vary from, it goes from market-based measurement approaches like the COVARs, Shapley values to indicator-based measurement approach. Starting from 2011, if I'm not mistaken, the Financial Stability Board and the Basel Committee have maintained a list of globally systemically important banks as part of an integrated set of policy measures to address systemic and moral hazard risk associated with systemically important financial institutions. The methodology was based on this indicator-based measurement approach and became a regulatory minimum starting from the beginning of 2018. So even if the discussion was right after the financial crisis, this binding regulation is pretty young. It starts from 2018. So considering that it is relatively short, it has a relatively short history, we don't know how much about its capacity and efficiency as both macro and macroprudential tool, and we don't know what is an impact on the financial sector and their effects. So what we do in this paper, we developed an agent-based model, starting from what we did before, arriving to the point having this policy laboratory, and we are trying to address some policy relevant questions that are on the pipeline of this stream of literature. In particular, we want to know how efficient is the BIS methodology of indicator-based measurement approach of identifying and neutralizing the systemically important banks in taming the financial instability. We want to know, is this additional capital imposed on these identified systemically important banks that appear in the list of Financial Stability Board, is it enough to preserve the safety and soundness of systemically important banks? And is this additional capital requirement, so-called also additional loss absorbing capacity, that is imposed on systemically important banks enough to overgo this too big to fail problem that was a main concern for many of the financial regulators, starting probably more for US? And if those financial institutions, in case of failure, are able to cover their losses themselves. We want also to know how the regulations of systemically important banks interact with other macroprudential tools and monetary policy, considering that our setup allows that. And we want to know if this regulation is creating kind of a trade-off with others and having effects on credit growth, considering that the model that I'm presenting, it has a strong mechanism of financial accelerator on supply side of credit. And we worry a lot about this aspect. Before going to show you some details of the model, even in 20 minutes, I'm not able to show the equations, but rather give you intuitions, I would like to highlight the need of this piece. Why I'm calling a piece, because it is a part of a trilogy, if we can call it, of interactions of macroprudential and monetary policy. Among us co-authors, we call it M&M models, because we have already two pieces ready. They are already published. The first one in 2017, end of 2017, Journal of Economic Behavior and Organization. And it was addressing the passage from the static capital requirement to dynamic ones, so countercyclical capital buffers, conservation buffers, and leverage. The second one that we published last year in Journal of Economic Dynamics and Control, it was addressing the liquidity requirements as a panacea against the liquidity crisis. And what we were missing basically was this last piece that is addressing the regulations of systemically important banks. So exactly this contribution is about that. This is the third piece of this M&M trilogy. And here we developed a stock consistent agent-based model with dynamic bank firm network. And here we have also relationship lending dynamics that is absolutely necessarily to have these endogenously growing systemically important banks. So having these dynamics, we want to analyze the interactions between monetary and prudential policies, and we want to see their impact on financial vulnerability and macro dynamics under the emergence of systemically important banks and their regulations in terms of application of additional capital surcharges. So after the model is ready, we use the model as a laboratory to possibly indicate alternative policies and find the best policy mixes to achieve a higher level of economic and financial stability. This is basically the idea of the model. Just to a bit open the curtains, in case if I wouldn't have any time to go towards result. So the model is endogenously generating systemically important banks. We found that the additional capital surcharges in systemically important banks have very much an effect on preventing the crisis. This Basel III requirement of additional capital surcharge is pointing mainly, it is designed in a way that it is mainly pointing on a too big to fail problem with very minimal importance to and attention to too interconnected to fail, too many to fail, and other issues. And actually, we are not the only one who noticed this drawback of regulatory setup. We also found out that additional capital surcharges imposed on systemically important banks, we don't account for the type of the bank activity. Later, I'm going to demonstrate how it is happening, and it has a one-size-fits-all problem. And finally, we found that additional loss absorbing capacity is not enough to ensure total coverage of the losses in case if the systemically important bank is failing. And again, we have some other colleagues along with also Passmore and Van Hoffen found a very strong argument for that based on the empirical data, but it is exactly the case. It's never enough. Probably this threshold of imposed capital is going to be even twice more when it is imposed now. It is not enough. Okay. Let me go a bit introducing the model, how it is working, giving you more intuition. So this is as I have mentioned, it is an extension of two previous models of Popoyan, Napoletano, Roventini, 2017 and 2020. We have two levels of agents. On the left-hand side, you see the micro-level agents. You have the consumers, firms, and banks. Bank is already endowed with interbank market. And on a macro part, you have agents that are responsible for macro policy. We have the government and the central bank. The population of the economy, it is a single country economy. It is and it is calibrated model. We have N of the people. And each of the people it has a type of EG. There is a fixed number of N durable goods, and you have corresponding types of the shops or firms who are producing this kind of goods. And to produce this kind of good, they need to hire a similar type of labor. Later, we have M banks. In this setup, we have 25 banks, and with two main properties that is allowing to generate the systemically important banks. As I have mentioned, this is a dynamic bank shop network. It means that if in previous two models, when we distribute the client network, every shop or firm is attached to a certain bank and he can't switch. In this setup, if the bank is, the shop, is receiving a rejection, he's able to switch the bank to go to another that has probably more lax financial regulations, more buffer to give a loan. So there is a dynamic bank shop network. The second aspect that is allowing this generation of systemically important banks is the relationship lending. And it is relying on a concept of long-term client-bank relationships. So you are easily lending to someone who you already know, rather than when to new one. Later, we have a government that is conducting the fiscal policy, the central bank that is conducting monetary and macroprudential policy. Some more details about each type of agents and the actions that are happening here. So we have a shop or firm, if you want, that is combining the production and trading operations. A shop of a type E is capable of buying a certain kind of a labor of his type, and he's paying money for that, so the wages are created. So he's converting this labor to a good and can sell it. The prices are varying across the shops. The shop is trying to rely on internal finance for the production purposes in case if he's in shortage, he's able to turn to a bank, to his bank initially touched to someone else in case if he's receiving a rejection from his own bank. The banks are accepting deposits from agents. They are giving out loans to shop owners. The loans are fully collateralized and by full recourse. Banks are applying haircut on a collateral, and it is determined as the fixed loan-to-value ratio. And the government is conducting the fiscal policy, is collecting the taxes, and central bank is setting the interest rate. Here we have different setups of interest rate. You can have the classical Taylor rule, a plain vanilla setup, pointing on inflation and output, dual mandate pointing on inflation and unemployment, or leaning against the financial win in this situation when it reacts to credit growth. Saying this, I would directly jump into what concerns the part of systemically important banks, because it is very interesting. I guess probably this is one of, so far as I know, the only ABM that is trying to imitate exactly the setup of indicator-based measurement approach. So what you see is a table that is somehow comparing what the BIS designed to be as an identification framework of systemically important banks. You see it in the second column. And then the third column, you see how we adjusted, considering that our balance sheet in certain aspects does not coincide with the real world balance sheet. For example, you can see here that there are cross-jurisdictional activities. Considering that there are not cross-border transactions, obviously we couldn't imitate it. So we tried to substitute it with some other indicator. So the rest fairly identical. So there are 5 categories on a base of which we are evaluating the balance sheets of the banks. Those are the size, interconnectedness, substitutability, complexity, and domestic sentiments that we borrowed it from the frameworks of Poletna and Friends, considering that we don't have cross-border transactions. So how it
Lilit,
is working? Yes.
Sorry, Lilit, 5 minutes. Okay.
Oh my God. Okay.
Thank
you.
So
basically, thank you. So basically, how it is working? There are all the categories, 5 categories, 5 indicators. All of them are attached an equal weight, and normalized to 1. Later, the individual indicators are computed as a share of individual contributions in aggregate. Later, the score for individual banks are summed up. And at the end of the day, maximum that you can get, considering that you have 5 indicators: size, interconnectedness, substitutability, complexity, and sentiments. And obviously, you can't imagine a single bank just taking all the space. You are ending up to have a score usually below 5. And later, earning your score, you are getting you are finding your place in a bucket. Depending on which bucket you are assigned additional capital requirement. Not to just sound like very theoretical, I want to show how in reality it looks like. This is what was published by Financial Stability Board in November of 2020. That is working for all the 2021. This is exactly the same logic. Do you see the buckets, 5 buckets? You can see that 5 and 4 bucket are empty. It seems that you don't have a super systemically important banks. Obviously, you never fill the bucket 5, considering that it is impossible. Either you have just a system with a single bank, or you have a multi-bank system. And you can see how the banks are placed there. It means that, for example, Citigroup of HS or HSBC, along with minimum capital requirements, they are also getting more capital buffer to keep. So how the setup is working, we're imposing the pre-crisis financial regulations in post-crisis one. In post-crisis, we have a capital requirement with static capital requirement plus countercyclical capital buffer, leverage requirement on the top of that, the additional loss absorbing capacity for systemically important banks if they are identified in the list. And at the end of the day, we have global liquidity standard. Going to the results firstly. First, a way to show you how this emergence of systemically important banks is happening. So you see the bubble chart that is showing the state of the art in 3 time points after 60 years of simulation with 150 Monte Carlo. We are depicting the bank size at 10th year, 45th year, and 60th year. You can see that starting from 10th year, it's kind of the balance sheet of the banks, their size is pretty symmetric. And later, the more you proceed in time, at a point time is 45 or 60, they are becoming bigger. So the size of the bubble is showing how big they are. Later, we started to see how the different risk scores are somehow correlated. This is a heat map based on Spearman's coefficients of rank correlation, considering that the scores are not normally distributed for measure robustness and comparability of the two samples that we have chosen. So what you see on the left-hand side of two figures, it is the correlation of the scores of the total sample. While below on the left-hand side chart, you will see just the 5 systemically important banks and the correlation between them. While in a right-hand side below, you will see those 5 banks just excluded. So here you have the normally systemically important or small banks. As you can notice, the correlation is bigger, is stronger in case of 5 most important institutions, and such a strong correlation you can't observe in case of among less and medium important financial institutions. And one can also notice that the correlation of the size is a major, it is mostly correlated with others. Later, probably with this chart, for someone can just look weird, but my kids call it the Agatha plot, considering that it has cycles like a stone. So it is showing the distribution of these quantitative indicators of kernel density estimates for the risk scores, the 5 risk scores. And what you can see for all the 5 indicators, more or less you have the similar picture. You have concentration of many banks that are normally of normal size, not very systemically important, and you have very few on the tail that are systemically important. And one can notice that in case of an amplitude, in terms of amplitude, the size is bigger. Later,
Lilit, 1 minute.
Yes? Okay, I will try to hurry up. So later we look at the bank failures in setup of different monetary policies. And when we have additional capital surcharge on systemically important banks, and we don't have. So the purple, in case we have the additional capital surcharge, and the green is without. You can notice that the additional capital surcharges have very marginal effect on the bank failure rate. Instead, it makes sense in a situation when you decouple it with leading against the wind monetary policy, then it addresses also the credit wealth. On a search to understand where this neutrality comes from, why it has this kind of a very marginal effect, we looked at the correlation between the size of banks' balance sheet, the assets, and the score of systemically importance. You see on the top of the simulation results, and we found really huge correlation, and it appeared that a similar result obtained the European Central Bank in the staff paper circulations, and we show exactly, find 10 differences. So they are very, very similar, showing that what drives the systemically important score is exactly the size. In this situation, the problem is arising. It is pointing the size of the balance sheet, but what it overlooks the activity the bank is getting involved. You see 2 balance sheets here, that one has an impressive big portfolio of corporate loans, that the second bank has a big amount of bonds. Both are assets. Both of those have the identical balance sheet size, but definitely the one on the left is more dangerous in terms of contagion and risk-taking behavior, right? So this is an aspect that systemically the Basel III regulations in terms of additional capital surcharges didn't pay attention. And the last slide on this, we also looked in terms of Aikman's financial stability map that is very diffused among central bankers and financial regulations to see on a rather chart if you treat our sample, you have the additional capital surcharges and you don't have, how we change the financial stability map. And what we see as an implication of this, I don't think that everybody can read that, but you can notice in case of switching on and off different financial regulatory tools, when you have a Basel III full-fledged setup in which we have also additional capital surcharges, you will notice that to compare with left-hand side that we don't have additional capital surcharge to the right-hand side, it is impressively increasing the size of balance sheet. So it is for sure addressing too big to fail and leverage, but it leaves all other aspects of systemically importance. And the last one this is a figure that is showing that along with bank failure, how much the bank is able to withdraw from accumulated buffer to close the capital loss, and which part is the government is doing. You can notice that together with bank failure, that is a blue line, and what was injected by the bank, you can see that almost always the government is constrained to inject the rest. It means that this accumulation of buffer is never enough. So we are pretty in line what was found out by other colleagues. Other research that we are going to proceed with, we are going to see alternative setups that can somehow be more useful or more efficient, as the 4C approach of Thomson that goes through 4 categories: contagion, correlation, concentration, and conditions. And considering that I don't have time, but I give some intuitions about already the results, perhaps I just skip it, and I'm sorry for a bit jumping the time.
No worries.
All. Thank you.
No worries. Many thanks, Lilit, for your excellent presentation. Ermanno, would you like to go ahead? My understanding is that you would like to share your screen. You have some slides that you have presented. So please go ahead. Let's see if this works. Yes, I can see a paper, and I can see the second slide that you have prepared. Yes. We can see the slides. Would you like to try again? For some reason, I cannot hear you.
The same for us.
Always some technical problems.
Here I am. Here I am.
Thank you.
Okay,
like
sorry. I'm sorry.
We
I
can
have my
see your
cat.
screen.
Okay, you see my slide. Okay, yes.
Now, yes, if you can click on this, we will be able to see your slides. Thank you.
Okay, okay.
You can see the
Wonderful.
second one. Thanks.
Thank you. I'm sorry. So, as I was saying, it is a very interesting paper, as usually the works of Lilit. What I like most is that is able to model in a very simple way, relatively simple way, both a credit and an interbank network. In this way, you are able to study both financial and the real part of the economy at the same time, and so the impact of this different part of the economy, their interaction. Moreover, the model is able to endogenously to let emerge systemically important banks, and this is not so simple, and this gives a lot of flexibility to the model. So there is not a given network, but the network endogenously is created. There is not a given structure of the size of firms, of banks, and this is very interesting. So what are the aim of the paper? Studying the effect of Basilea III regulation, essentially. The paper are tested different monetary policies and what are the impact on different kind of regulation. And moreover, is test a different way of selecting the systemic important banks that is also more effective. So the result, the way in which systemically important banks are identified by Basilea is not so effective, according to the paper, because it's too focused on size, while it's possible to identify other way to, it's possible to create other methods to identify the systemically important banks that can be more effective to reduce systemic risk. And in the paper is show another way. This is very interesting. Moreover, there is still need for government intervention to cover systemically important banks if we are using Basilea III. And this is another important result of the paper. There are also other different results, but I think these three are the most important, at least for me. So, something on the result. I think the model is very nice, very well done. So what I'm going to say is not some critique, but some point that maybe I would like to deepen, and it's possible to deepen using this kind of model. First of all, as we have said, the model is able endogenously to let the credit and the interbank network to evolve. So maybe it could be nice also to see what are the effects of Basileia regulation or the effect of alternative ways of identifying systemically important banks. What are the effect of policies to try to reduce systemic risk on the network? So these policies are able to modify structurally the network in order to reduce the systemic risk or not. This could be, I think, interesting. I'm sure that something emerged on the paper. Moreover, another point, because the paper treats both the interbank network and the credit network, it could be very interesting to see what are the relation between macroprudential policies and the business cycle. In particular, if there is the emergence of some contrast between monetary policies and macroprudential policies, especially in the business cycle downturn, when you want to increase credit, but maybe it could be riskier to increase credit for the banks and so on. So it could be interesting also to explore more this side, the real effect of these macroprudential policies, maybe in other papers. And the last point, I think that could be interesting, maybe in future works, is what happens when the policymakers start to apply non-conventional policies. I think the model could be quite useful to study this kind of non-conventional quantitative easing policies and what are the impact on systemic risk more than Taylor rule monetary policies. Could be, I think, an interesting point. And that's all.